Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Is it too loud or it's okay? Okay. Okay. To begin with, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak here. Uh, and this is a program that I shall read the text so it doesn't wander too far from the topic. The origins of Rensselaerswyck date from the Dutch New Netherland in the 17th century. A series of expansive alluvial floodplain flats along the Hudson River surrounded both Fort Nassau, built in 1614, and then Fort Orange, built in 1624 by the Dutch West India Company, which had a monopoly of the fur trade. The silty soil was rich and fertile, and much of it had been kept clear and used by Indians to grow corn and other crops for centuries. This land soon attracted the attention of the Dutch, who recognized a possible source of income in addition to the lucrative fur trade. Members of the West India Company included Kilian van Rensselaer, a merchant in Amsterdam. In 1628, Van Rensselaer and other shareholders of the company began a movement to allow grants of company land to individuals for their personal benefit. The company charter of 1629 consequently enabled stockholders to establish settlements of 50 persons on company land grants. Such stockholders were designated as patrons, who were to be called patroons. The company granted each patroon administrative jurisdiction over his colony. Kilian van Rensselaer registered himself in 1629 as a patroon of a colony to be established on both sides of the Hudson River in the area around Fort Orange. In 1630 and 1631, he purchased from the Indians the fertile lands on the west side of the river, extending from Burin Island, at present Queens, New York, north to People's Island, located at the mouth of the Mohawk River, with a smaller tract on the east side of the river opposite Fort Orange. A distance of 2 days' journey inland from the Hudson River was specified. Under the contract of 1629, Kilian van Rensselaer thus became owner of a patroonship called the Colony of Rensselaerswyck in perpetuity, and when a patroon died, the title was to pass each time to his or her successor upon payment of 20 guilders to the company. Van Rensselaer soon began signing contracts with Dutch farmers in the company, to the company. Van Rensselaer soon began, he provided each tenant with servants, livestock, tools, equipment, and a dwelling. By 1640, the farmers' contracts were evolving into formal leases with fixed terms. And later in the 17th century, under the English, leases became perpetual leases by which farms were granted forever and could be sold or inherited by the farmers under certain conditions that included continuous annual payment of rent to the van Rensselaers. On October 17th, 1685, English Governor Thomas Dongan granted the van Rensselaers ownership of the Manor of Rensselaerswyck, which included the entire patroonship extending inland from each side of the Hudson River 24 miles. The south boundary was at Burin Island again, and the north boundary was at the Cohoes Falls. The manor included nearly all of present Albany County and the southern 2/3 of present Rensselaer County. The 1685 patent required the Rensselaers to pay the King of England an annual rent of 50 bushels of good winter wheat. By 1700, the leases that the Rensselaers granted to their farmers required each farmer to obtain the approval of the patroon before selling to a new tenant. Then there was the added requirement that if the farm was sold to a new tenant, the patroon could claim a quarter or some other fraction of the sale price. This condition, which became very onerous, was known as the quarter sale or alienation fee, and became very controversial by the early 19th century. The patroon, Stephen Rensselaer III, died in January 1839, and a son, William P. Rensselaer, inherited the East Manor. In the West Manor, attempts to collect unpaid back rents meant almost immediate resistance, and in the early 1840s, unrest spread to the East Manor as well. By 1844, the revolt was widespread, and in 1852, the Court of Appeals invalidated the hated alienation fees in leases granted after 1787. Finally, the legislature passed the Anti-Rent Act of 1860, which declared the farms could not be sold with the requirement that rents be paid on the property forever, as a burden to subsequent owners. A typical lease from patroon Stephen Rensselaer III required annual payment of a specified number of bushels of good, clean, merchantable winter wheat, often in addition to 4 fat fowls and a day's service with team and wagon. The signing of a lease was usually delayed for a few years until the farm was sufficiently improved and productive. In the late 1780s, the boundaries of hundreds of farms in both the East and West Manors were each carefully surveyed by John E. Van Allen. Van Allen drew maps showing all the farms in the East and West Manors, and fortunately, some of those remarkable maps still exist and are preserved in the New York State Library. The maps show names of each farmer and often a comparison of the surveyed farm boundaries with modern fence lines and field boundaries on aerial photographs can reveal the exact original location of a farm. In other cases, the chain of title for an existing farm can be traced back with deeds to the original Rensselaerswyck lease, many of which are also preserved in the New York State Library. Other than church records, leases, and sometimes account books, there are usually few written documents that provide an understanding of how the families of tenant farmers lived or their quality of life. Archaeological excavations have occurred at 4 house sites of Rensselaerswyck tenant farmers, and reports on those excavations have been written. The excavations provide information on the daily lives of those farmers, and they can answer questions that are not answered by documents. Our present knowledge of dating artifacts, for example, can answer questions about when a site was initially occupied, and which can be often as much as 10 or 20 years before the date of the Rensselaer lease. Excavations suggest that these tenant farmers were prosperous, comfortable, and well supplied with food and material. At the site of the William Orlop farm in the town of Colonie, for example, archaeologists uncovered the bones of butchered pigs and cows, which had served as food, with lesser numbers of sheep and goats. The William Orlop family of German origin may have settled the site as early as 1760. And in 1771, William signed a lease with Catherine of Rensselaer. Other artifacts from the site include pre-Revolutionary War buttons, an unusual number of gun flints, wine bottle and case bottle fragments, and fragments of Delft pottery and slip-decorated earthenware. The site was clearly occupied in the 1760s and 1770s, but curiously, the site is not shown on the 1767 Bleecker map of Rensselaerswyck. Occupation of the site continued into the 19th century. The site, now destroyed, was on Wade Road at the location of the new state police headquarters. Archaeological test trenches also have been excavated in the town of Nassau, Rensselaer County, at the site of the John Dusenbury farm. John Dusenbury, born in 1723, migrated from Dutchess County and settled within the south boundary of Rensselaerswyck, probably about 1770. The account book of John E. Van Allen's store in nearby Schodack records purchases made there by Dusenbury in 1772. His son John, born in 1753, was arrested as a loyalist and put in jail in Albany. Several times he was rearrested and then released until by 1781 he had enlisted in the British Jessop's Rangers as an ensign. The family was divided, for his father, John Sr., served in the 4th Regiment of the Albany County Militia. John Jr. settled in Canada as a loyalist, and a record described him as, quote, a wealthy farmer's son in that province of New York, end quote. He returned to Nassau, however, in 1784 to settle his affairs, and a John Dusenbury is listed in the 1790 census next to Enoch Dusenbury. Enoch was a brother of John Jr., the loyalist. The 1790 census record could be either John Sr. or John Jr., the loyalist, but the family size corresponds most closely to John Jr., the loyalist. By 1790, John Sr.'s sons were adults, and by 1790, John Jr. and his wife had only 2 children, both daughters. John Jr. had built a house in Canada in 1787, so perhaps briefly he had homes in 2 locations. Enoch signed a lease for a farm in 1793, but the 1800 Van Allen map of Rensselaerswyck farms in Nassau shows only the boundaries of the farm leased to John Dusenbury, whoever that was. John Sr. died in 1811, and John Jr., the loyalist, died in Canada in 1813. Most likely, John Jr., the loyalist, remained in Canada. An 18th century frame house stood on the Dusenbury farm until 1974, when it was destroyed. Fortunately, Don Carpentier of Eastfield Village in 1973 made a careful examination of the structure, which included a possible construction date of circa 1770 or earlier. It appeared that the original 20 by 20 foot one-room house was enlarged between 1785 and 1790. The Dutch-style ceiling beams of the first floor of the original house were carefully smoothed and finished. All the nails were pre-1785 hand-wrought nails. How much earlier than 1785 was the original house remained a question. In an attempt to provide an answer, a 10-foot trench, a test trench, and 2 test squares, each 2 feet square, were excavated. One end of the test trench extended from the wall of the original house. The results were disappointing. The artifacts from the earliest soil layer in the test trench included nothing earlier than pearlware ceramics. a type that was first introduced in 1779. Some of the earliest types of pearlware that were found include typical green and blue shell-edged pearlware plate fragments. There were no artifacts clearly dating earlier than 1780, so perhaps this original house was not as early as we thought, and perhaps an earlier pre-Revolutionary War house was located nearby or elsewhere on the farm. Further archaeological testing at the site and further genealogical and historical research is needed. Genealogical research was essential in identifying and dating two other tenant farmhouse sites in Rensselaerswyck. These are the Vandenburgh-Mark House in the Town of Colonie in Albany County and the Martin Gehler Jr. site in the Town of Schodack, Rensselaer County. The Vandenburgh-Mark House is presently threatened, and the Colonie Historical Society is trying to save it. It is located at 99 Johnson Road in Colonie, and it is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Like the Dusenbury house, the oldest portion of the frame house consists of a single, small, open room with a large cooking fireplace. There is a brick beehive oven that protrudes through the house wall. Inside, stairs ascend steeply to a loft space above the single room. The house was constructed with hand-wrought nails. A larger portion was added early in the 19th century on the opposite end, opposite the fireplace and bake oven. The house was known as the Mark House, and it was always assumed the Mark family built the house and lived there. The Mark family cemetery is still located on a nearby piece of the property to the southeast. The cemetery has been restored. Also, piled near the house are many gravestones, some of which have been used to pave the walkways. The gravestones memorialize some of Colonie's earliest farmers that lived nearby, including the Lansing and the Fondas. It is likely these gravestones were part of an original unknown Lansing cemetery. The neighborhood was known as the Bocht, named for the Dutch word Bocht, meaning the bend in the Mohawk River to the north. Historian Kyler Reynolds provided a useful genealogy of the Mark family. Thomas Mark, born in England in 1728, with his wife and their 5 children, sailed in 1774 to North America, where they intended to settle. On the same ship was also the large family of John Haswell, with his wife and 11 children. During the short voyage, the families became well acquainted, and later Thomas Mark's 4 daughters and 1 son each married one of the Haswell children. The son, Isaac Mark, born in 1757, settled in Cherry Valley, New York, and initially he was a loyalist when the Revolutionary War began. But about 1779, after the horrible Cherry Valley massacre, he became a patriot and married Mary Haswell, a daughter of John Haswell. About this time, Thomas the father, the son Isaac, and daughter-in-law Mary moved from Cherry Valley, which was a dangerous frontier area, to Albany County, and presumably built the Mark House at Johnson Road in the present town of Colonie, which was then known as Watervliet. In 1779 or 1780. Sadly, Mary Haswell Mark died in 1782, after which Isaac Mark married her younger sister, Margaret Haswell, born in 1767. Isaac served in the 4th Regiment of the Albany County Militia under Colonel Killian Rensselaer. In 1791, Isaac Mark and his older brother-in-law, Joseph Haswell, signed a lease for a large Rensselaerswyck Manor farm of 695.7 acres in Watervliet. It was thus assumed that the Mark House stood on that farm. Isaac Mark died in 1843, and his widow, Margaret, lived in the Mark House until her death in 1856. This was not the whole story, however. Architectural historians believe the original Mark House likely dated from about 1790, while historians believed it could date from about 1780, when the Mark family arrived. A close look at the original Rensselaer leases in the New York State Library tells an entirely different story. The farm surveys in each lease and deed are critical, and it was necessary to map the boundaries of each farm in order to determine their locations. The Mark House does not stand on the farm of 695.7 acres, leased in 1791 to Isaac Mark and Joseph Haswell. That farm was elsewhere. Instead, the house is on land that was a farm of 238 acres, leased on November 30th, 1788, to Cornelius C. Vandenburgh by the patroon, Stephen Rensselaer. The 1788 lease no longer exists, but it is known by references to it in other leases and deeds. Cornelius C. Vandenburgh, born in 1738, was a son of Cornelius M. Vandenburgh and Rachel de Ritter. In 1767, Cornelius married Catherine Lansing, a daughter of Franciscan Lansing and Maricha Leverson. Most likely, Cornelius C. Vandenburgh built his house about the time of his marriage. The 1767 Bleecker map of Rensselaerswyck clearly shows his house located west of present Bott Road. The map also shows the home of Franciscus Lansing, his father-in-law and near neighbor to the north. It is not known why the map lists Cornelius C. Vandenburgh with King as his alias. The house in sight therefore dates as early as the 1760s, much earlier than the presumed date of 1790. It is possible Cornelius C. Vandenburgh came to the book from Half Moon in Saratoga County. After 1767, he may have continued to own property there as well as in the book. During the Revolution, he enlisted and served in the 3rd or Watervliet Regiment of the Albany County Militia. He added more to his holdings in the Bott on November 25, 1789, when he leased from Stephen Rensselaer a large tract east of and adjoining his farm. This tract was 340 acres. The original lease still exists. Cornelius and Catherine never had children. The 1790 census shows that his household consisted only of himself, his wife Catherine, and one other white female, besides enslaved persons. After the death of Cornelius C. Vandenburgh, his heirs in 1797 sold the 238-acre farm to Abraham G. Lansing. In 1808, Lansing sold the original 238 acres to Isaac Mark, and this included the house which became known as the Mark House. The 1810 census lists Isaac Mark living there with a large family, for which he added the large north portion of the house. In April 2022, a test square 4 feet by 4 feet in size was excavated in the front yard of the Vandenburgh-Mark House. 4 thin soil strata were revealed, and there were relatively few artifacts. Evidently, the area had been kept free of trash. The earliest soil layer, stratum 4, 11 to 13 inches in depth below the surface, contained 5 small pieces of ceramic ware. One piece of ceramic is a dark cream-colored earthenware, the type of ceramic developed and produced in England beginning about 1760. The other fragments are pieces of blue shell-edged pearlware, which could date as early as 1780, and they are similar to examples from the Dusenbury site. Stratum 4, therefore, could represent occupation of the site between 1760 and 1780, but no other artifacts clearly dating before 1780 were found. Other interesting artifacts include a slate pencil. Slate pencils could be used with a slate board to communicate with people who were deaf. They were also used to calculate numbers rather than use expensive paper. A fragment of a clay pipe bowl is from a clay pipe that had a patriotic decoration that included a molded United States flag shield, a variation of the design adopted by Congress in June 1782 as the escutcheon in the Great Seal of the United States. The flag shield variation used on this clay pipe was used as early as 1785. Like the Dusenbury site, the artifacts indicate occupation of the site as early as the Revolutionary War by Cornelius C. Vandenburgh, but it was not the Mark family until much later. Other Rensselaerswyck tenants' house, the other site where genealogical research was essential in identifying and dating was the Martin Gehler Jr. site in the town of Schodack, Rensselaer County. A new Stewart's shops and gas station stands on the site. The site was on the north side of Route 20, just west of the village of Nassau. In 1959, it was a visible stone cellar hole which attracted my attention. I was interested in historical archaeology and had been reading books about how archaeologists excavated. I obtained permission to excavate and laid out a grid system. I continued my excavation until 1963. The very kind owners of the property had photos of the vacant house that once stood there, which they tore down in the 1930s. The survey map of farms in Schodack, produced in 1788 by John E. Van Allen, showed that the roads that still lead southward from Route 20, opposite the house site, were the main roads that led to the Hudson River at Schodack Landing. Known as the Schodack Landing Road, it was the main access route for supplies, right there. And those two roads led to Schodack Landing. It was the main access route for supplies and communication. The Van Allen map also suggested that the house stood on the farm surveyed for Hugh McMullen. Hugh McMullen was in Schodack by 1771 when he was married. The account book for John E. Van Allen's store at Schodack Landing records numerous purchases of goods there by Hugh McMullen in 1772. He was evidently a son of John McMullen, who also had a farm in Schodack southwest of his farm. John McMullen, the father, became a loyalist and went to Canada, but Hugh McMullen remained in Schodack. Much research was done on Hugh McMullen and his family, but the artifacts from the site that I excavated did not seem consistent with a site occupied from as early as 1771 or 1772. The Hugh McMullen farm was leased in May 1793 to Jacob Milham and then released to Lewis Herrick in 1853. Research with deeds continued unsuccessfully in an effort to link the site to its 19th century owners. The 1854 Rensselaer County map clearly shows the Herrick site to the west of the house site, and the house site is west of the large house owned by Samuel McClellan. The house site is right there. No, right there. We don't know who Ben Beckwith was, but that's still a mystery. Another look at the Van Allen survey maps of original farms reveal that the pointed south tip of the farm of Martin Gehler, the south tip, which is way down here, here's the road that's today present-day Route 20, and the southern tip of this big farm, which was Martin Gehler Jr.'s, just touched Route 20 at that point. The southern tip of the farm of Martin Gehler Jr. touched the east-west highway, which is today Route 20. It seemed unlikely, but it appeared the house could have stood within that point of the Gehler farm boundary, but with very little access to the highway. Martin Gehler Jr. was born about 1752 in Beekman Precinct, Dutchess County. Martin Gehler Jr., with his father and brothers and sister, evidently moved to Rensselaerswyck between 1773 and 1777, with leases to Martin Jr. and Martin Sr. for two adjoining farms in Schodack. The Gehlers became loyalists in anticipation of the British invasion under General Burgoyne in 1777. Unfortunately, they joined their loyalist neighbors in a raid near Kinderhook that summer in which an American officer was murdered, after which they joined Burgoyne's army. They were captured at Saratoga and were soon arrested for the murder of the American officer. One brother, Christopher Gehler, was executed in Albany for the crime, but Martin Jr. was eventually released after 8 months of imprisonment for lack of evidence. Martin Jr. was closely watched, but in 1779 he evidently established his farm and married Magdalena Wolf. She was, like Martin, from a German family. Their first child, Barnabas, was born in 1781, and in 1782, Martin enlisted in the 4th Regiment of the Albany County Militia. He was no longer a loyalist. His family grew rapidly, but the farm was not very productive. It was leased to Captain Thomas Tobias in 1790 for an annual rent of 18 bushels of winter wheat, beginning in 1794. The Gehler family continued to live at the south tip of the original Gehler farm. Tobias owned more than just the Gehler farm, and portions of his extensive adjoining land were occupied by others after 1800. The northern portions of the Gehler farm were sold by Thomas Tobias in 1820, but Barney Gehler and his family continued to occupy the south tip of 24 acres, which Tobias reserved for them and claimed to have conveyed to Barney Gehler's father-in-law, William Lowry. Among the papers of genealogist Ralph D. Phillips, I discovered papers relating to the 24 acres occupied by the Gehlers. The papers include a deed dated 1804 in which Thomas Tobias sold 24 acres to William Lowry. This is a mysterious document and apparently fraudulent document, unrecorded, in the county courthouse, in which the property description is entirely fictional. It looks okay, but the property boundaries make no sense. The original Gehler farm was sold to Dr. Samuel McClellan in 1824, but the Barney Gehler family continued to live on their farm of 24 acres until 1854. The occupants of the house after 1854 were the Shibley family, and they were active in the anti-rent movement. The McClellans also were anti-renters, and Dr. Samuel McClellan actively supported other reform movements. His daughter married Anson Bingham, and Anson Bingham inherited the property. Anson Bingham was a lawyer and a politician, and he was a vocal supporter of women's rights legislation. He gave advice and assistance to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. He was very active in the anti-rent movement and deserves recognition. His law office stood nearby, abandoned for many years, in a field northeast of the Gehler house. Excavations in a slumped corner of the cellar hole revealed a sequence of soil layers. From these layers, 1,000 artifacts were recovered, of which more than half are ceramic fragments. From the earliest soil layer, half of the creamware is of the dark cream-colored variety, which likely dates before 1780. Most of the ceramic fragments are pearlware, which was produced in England from about 1780 to 1835. There are many fragments of blue and green shell-edged pearlware plates typical of the 1790s, the same as at the other three Rensselaerswyck tenant farm sites. A reconstructed rim of a hand-decorated pearlware saucer of the 1790s is very attractive. Other pearlware is hand-decorated with Chinese patterns typical of the 1780s. Fragments of at least 2 teapots made of refined red earthenware from England were found. The ceramic fragments also include pieces of expensive Chinese porcelain, hand-decorated in blue, and there are fragments of overglazed, hand-decorated porcelain. One of these is a piece of a porcelain cup with overglazed enamel decoration in red, green, brown, and pink. It is a good example of porcelain with famille rose decoration, which dates from about 1750 to 1800. A two-pronged fork handle is of the pistol handle design and dates probably from the 1750s or 1760s. There is one fragment of English white salt glazed stoneware which most likely dates before 1775. The clay tobacco pipe fragments include pipe bowls with a distinctive pattern of vertical ribs molded along the seam line on both front and back. Examples have not been found in other American sites, but examples excavated in England were made in Bristol and Somersetshire in England. 2 pipe bowl fragments have a part of an early version of the Great Seal of the United States, adopted in 1782. One of these was a design for the Great Seal considered only briefly by Congress in June 1782. Perhaps it actually dates from 1782, the year that Martin Gehler enlisted in the 4th Regiment of the Albany County Militia. It is interesting that a different clay pipe fragment with the Great Seal was also found at the Vandenburgh-Mark site, also occupied by tenants who enlisted in the Albany County Militia in the Revolution. From the Gehler site, there is a greater number of slate pencils, a total of 8 slate pencils. The evidence suggests that the Gehler site could have been occupied before 1780, but most likely the site dates from about 1780 or when Martin Gehler Jr. decided to give up being a loyalist and became a patriotic American. The Gehlers seems to have been prosperous, at least initially. The complete report on the Martin Gehler site is available online at academia.edu. Both Martin Gehler Jr. and Isaac Mark were former loyalists who enlisted in the Albany County Militia. There are many opportunities for further comparisons of archaeological, genealogical, and demographic evidence relating to tenant farm sites of the 18th century. The Rensselaerswyck tenant farmhouse sites are rapidly being lost in Albany and Rensselaer counties, but it is hoped that future excavations will provide additional data for comparative studies. It is important to remember that the genealogists who are working at these sites are both archaeologists and historians, and the three disciplines are extremely important in the procedures of doing archaeology, and I hope these examples are good examples of the combination of genealogy, history, and archaeology. Thank you very much.